It was announced without warning, without gradual rollout, and without the kind of long public debate you would expect for a decision this big. One press conference, one statement. And suddenly, millions of Americans over the age of 65 were left asking a question they never thought they'd have to ask this way. Can I still drive? Not next decade, not someday, but soon. Because what was just revealed isn't a minor update or a routine policy adjustment. It's a fundamental change to how senior drivers will be judged, tested, and potentially removed from the road starting February 2026. And whether you're driving every day, only occasionally, or simply value the freedom of knowing you can, this announcement puts that independence under a microscope. The most unsettling part isn't just what was said, it's how fast it happened, how quietly it was prepared, and how many people it affects all at once. More than 50 million licensed drivers, millions of families, entire communities where driving isn't optional, it's survival. And tonight, that reality has officially shifted. What makes this moment so alarming is not just the rules themselves, but the way they arrived. Transportation officials had predicted something was coming. Advocacy groups had feared it. Many seniors dismissed it as rumor, speculation, or political noise. But this morning, those rumors became policy. Not after years of public hearings, not after state-by-state debate, but in a single federal announcement that crossed a line senior advocates hoped would never be crossed. Because once that line breaks, it doesn't just redraw regulations, it redraws lives. The announcement made it clear that the federal government is changing how it views senior drivers, not as individuals, but as a category to be assessed, tested, and filtered. And when policies shift this quickly, it's never accidental. It signals urgency, pressure, and intent. Before we get into who is fighting back and why the response has been so explosive, it's critical to understand exactly what was announced and why it matters so deeply. Because this wasn't framed as a suggestion, it wasn't framed as optional guidance for states, it was presented as a comprehensive framework, one that sets the tone for how licensing agencies across the country will operate going forward. And when federal regulators move this decisively, especially without years of public debate, it means they believe something has changed enough to justify action now. That's why this announcement has sent shockwaves through Washington, state governments, and senior communities nationwide. Not because it came out of nowhere, but because it confirms that something many hoped would stay hypothetical is now very real. And once you understand what's inside this framework, the urgency, the backlash, and the growing national fight surrounding it will make a lot more sense. Before we go any further, let me quickly introduce myself so you understand why this matters and why we're taking the time to walk through it carefully. I'm Sophia, and my role here is simple: to help you understand what's actually being decided, how it affects you personally, and what's being done behind the scenes right now. Not speculation, not panic, just clear factual context at a moment when clarity matters more than ever. Because once you hear what's inside this new framework, you'll understand why senior advocacy groups reacted with such urgency and why this announcement has already become one of the most politically charged transportation decisions in years. Here's what federal transportation officials confirmed will take effect beginning February 2026. Unless blocked or significantly altered. First, mandatory cognitive screening tied to license renewal starting at age 65. This is not a basic eye chart or a routine formality. These assessments are designed to measure reaction time, memory recall, and decision-making under simulated driving conditions. In practical terms, this means that renewing your license will no longer be based solely on your driving record or vision, but on standardized cognitive benchmarks that many seniors have never been required to meet before. Second, renewal timelines will be shortened significantly. Drivers between 65 and 74 will no longer renew every 8 years. That window is cut in half to 4 years. Drivers 75 and older will face renewals every 2 years. That may sound administrative, but in reality it means more frequent testing, more frequent fees, and more opportunities for licenses to be delayed, restricted, or denied. Third, mandatory road tests will be required for any driver over 70 who has been involved in an at-fault accident, regardless of how minor that accident may have been. A low-speed fender bender, a parking lot incident, any at-fault determination now carries the potential for a full driving reevaluation. And fourth, physicians will be placed under new reporting expectations, requiring doctors to notify licensing authorities if they believe a patient poses a potential driving risk. That shifts responsibility in a way that deeply concerns both seniors and medical professionals because it places judgment calls into an already strained healthcare system and ties them directly to license eligibility. Taken together, these measures represent the most sweeping federal-level changes to senior driving requirements in more than 4 decades. And that's not an exaggeration. The federal government rarely intervenes this directly in what has traditionally been a state-managed process, unless it is signaling a fundamental shift. Officials frame these rules as safety-driven, pointing to accident statistics and consistency across states. But to advocacy groups, the issue isn't whether safety matters. It's how safety is being enforced and who bears the burden of proof. Under this framework, age becomes the trigger, not demonstrated impairment. A healthy 65-year-old with a clean driving record faces hurdles that a younger driver with documented issues may never encounter. That discrepancy is at the heart of the backlash unfolding right now. Because these rules don't just add requirements, they change the assumption. They shift seniors from being presumed capable unless proven otherwise to being required to repeatedly prove capability, simply because of age. And once that standard is set, the implications extend far beyond the DMV. This is why the reaction wasn't delayed. This is why it wasn't polite. And this is why, within hours of the announcement, the fight had already begun. The reaction from senior advocacy groups was immediate. And that alone tells you how seriously this announcement was taken. This wasn't the kind of response that comes after weeks of internal discussion or carefully drafted position papers. Within hours, organizations that rarely move in unison were aligned, mobilized, and openly confrontational. The reason was simple. This framework didn't just adjust procedures, it established a precedent. Once age becomes the primary trigger for testing and restriction, the door opens to policies that treat millions of capable drivers as potential risks by default. Advocacy leaders understood that if they allowed this moment to pass quietly, any future challenge would be framed as resistance to an already accepted norm. So they moved before that narrative could settle. Statements released the same day described the announcement as discriminatory, overreaching, and unsupported by the kind of data that would justify such sweeping measures. But more importantly, they made it clear this would not be a symbolic disagreement. This was going to be fought strategically, legally, and publicly. Senior advocates were careful not to deny that some individuals, regardless of age, should not be driving. That argument would have been easy to dismiss. Instead, they focused on the structure of the policy itself. Age-based cutoffs, mandatory testing without individualized cause, and a framework that treated chronology as evidence. They argued this violated both fairness and constitutional protections. What followed was one of the fastest coordinated advocacy responses Washington has seen in years. Within 3 hours of the announcement, legal teams were already preparing challenges aimed not at the idea of safety, but at the implementation. This distinction matters. By targeting how the rules were constructed rather than why they were proposed, advocates position themselves as defenders of civil rights, not opponents of public safety. Legal experts working with senior organizations began outlining constitutional arguments centered on equal protection and arbitrary classification. The concern was not hypothetical. Under the new framework, a 65-year-old in perfect health would face mandatory cognitive testing, while a younger driver with documented impairments could continue driving without additional scrutiny. That imbalance became the central legal pressure point. At the same time, senior organizations across all 50 states activated communication networks that had been built quietly over years. Phone banks were opened, email campaigns launched, meetings with state officials were scheduled within days, not weeks. This wasn't outrage, this was preparation. Transportation analysts watching the situation noted how unusual the speed was. Advocacy groups typically respond in stages. This time, they skipped the early phases and went straight to escalation. That alone signaled that this framework had crossed a threshold no one was willing to tolerate. As more details emerged throughout the day, the urgency only intensified. Analysts confirmed that the framework was designed to be enforceable immediately at the state level through funding incentives and standardized testing protocols. In other words, this wasn't a suggestion. It was a mechanism, a system that could be implemented quickly, measured easily, and defended statistically regardless of individual outcomes. That realization is what pushed advocacy groups from protest into litigation. Preliminary injunctions were prepared to block implementation before February 2026, forcing the Department of Transportation to defend the framework in federal court, rather than relying on bureaucratic momentum. This strategy wasn't accidental. If the rules went into effect, even temporarily, reversing them later would become exponentially harder. Once licenses are revoked or restricted, damage is already done. Independence lost doesn't come back easily, so advocates moved to stop the process before it could begin. By the end of the day, legal filings were already underway in multiple jurisdictions. State-level senior organizations began targeting governors and legislators who had quietly signaled support for the framework in recent weeks. Medical associations operating independently started questioning the scientific validity of the cognitive testing models being cited, And all of it happened fast enough to prevent the Department of Transportation from controlling the narrative. Instead of being framed as a safety upgrade, the framework was now being discussed as a civil liberties issue. And once a policy enters that territory, it becomes far more difficult to defend quietly. Behind the legal language and policy frameworks are numbers that make the situation impossible to dismiss. More than 50 million licensed drivers in the United States are over the age of 65. That's not a niche group. That's one of the largest and most consistent voting blocs in the country. Transportation analysts reviewing the proposed cognitive screening criteria estimate that millions of those drivers could struggle to meet initial benchmarks, not because they are unsafe behind the wheel, but because standardized tests often fail to account for normal age-related changes that don't affect real-world driving ability. Reaction time in a lab is not the same as judgment at a four-way stop. Memory recall on a screen is not the same as decades of driving experience. Yet, under this framework, those distinctions are blurred. Add in shortened renewal cycles, mandatory road tests after even minor incidents, and increased testing fees, and the impact compounds quickly. States stand to collect billions in new administrative and testing revenue, but families stand to lose something far more valuable: independence. For many seniors, driving isn't a convenience. It's access to groceries, medical care, community, and dignity. When that access is restricted, the consequences ripple outward. Adult children rearrange work schedules. Rural residents face isolation. Healthcare outcomes decline. These aren't abstract policy outcomes. They are lived realities. And that's why advocacy groups have framed this issue not as transportation reform, but as a fundamental quality of life decision affecting millions who have done nothing wrong. What makes the situation even more volatile is the political timing. This announcement did not happen in a vacuum. It landed during a period of intense pressure on federal transportation leadership. Safety advocates have been demanding stricter oversight of senior driving for years, citing select accident data and high-profile incidents. At the same time, rural lawmakers are warning that aggressive restrictions could devastate communities with little or no public transportation. Medical associations are pushing for clearer liability protections, concerned about being held responsible for failing to report patients who later cause accidents. Civil liberties groups are increasingly vocal about age-based discrimination, and looming over all of it is an election cycle where regulatory overreach has become a political flashpoint. When officials release sweeping frameworks under these conditions, it's rarely a sign of confidence. It's a sign of urgency. Insiders describe it as a move made under pressure, an attempt to establish control before shifting political winds make action impossible. But that calculation may have underestimated one critical factor. Seniors are not disengaged, they are not disorganized, and they are not politically passive. If anything, they are more responsive to perceived threats to independence than almost any other group. That's why this announcement has already triggered reactions far beyond transportation circles. Congressional staffers are now monitoring the situation closely, aware that any policy affecting tens of millions of older voters carries serious electoral consequences. Early indications suggest emergency hearings are being scheduled, not as a formality, but as damage control. Legislators who supported similar measures in the past are suddenly cautious, sensing the intensity of the backlash. And the Department of Transportation, which expected to guide the narrative as a safety initiative, now finds itself defending the timing, the scope, and the fairness of its approach. Quietly, some officials are signaling openness to adjustments, a word that rarely appears unless recalibration is already underway. But advocates aren't slowing down. They understand that hesitation is not retreat, it's reassessment, and reassessment can lead either to compromise or to a more refined push forward. The next few weeks will determine which path is taken, because once the political machinery engages, this issue will no longer be decided in press conferences. It will be decided in courtrooms, committee rooms, and ultimately at the ballot box. And everyone involved knows it. As lawmakers and advocacy groups began responding publicly, another influence moved quietly but decisively in the background: the insurance industry. For years, major insurers have lobbied for stricter senior driving requirements, arguing that age-related risk should be addressed more aggressively to reduce claims exposure. They've funded studies. They've supported research that emphasizes cognitive decline metrics, and they've contributed heavily to campaigns of legislators who favor tighter licensing controls. None of this is new. What's new is the timing. Industry groups released statements of support for the new framework within hours of the announcement, praising it as a long overdue modernization of safety standards. That alignment raised immediate red flags among policy analysts. When federal agencies, insurers, and select medical associations move in parallel, it rarely happens by coincidence. Follow the incentives, and the picture becomes clearer. Stricter testing leads to fewer insured drivers in higher risk categories. Reduced exposure lowers payout risk, and standardized federal benchmarks make underwriting decisions easier to justify. None of this requires malicious intent to be consequential. Systems respond to incentives whether individuals intend harm or not. But for seniors, the outcome feels the same. Increased scrutiny, higher costs, and the constant need to prove capability in order to retain something once assumed. Medical organizations found themselves pulled into the debate as well. Under the new framework, physicians would be expected to report patients they believe pose a driving risk. On paper, that sounds straightforward. In practice, it introduces ethical and legal complications. Doctors worry about liability. Patients worry about honesty. Trust erodes when medical conversations carry potential licensing consequences. Several independent medical associations questioned the scientific validity of the cognitive testing models cited by the Department of Transportation, noting that many such tests were designed for clinical screening, not real-world driving prediction. A person can score poorly on a standardized assessment and still navigate traffic safely through experience, caution, and adaptive behavior. Conversely, a high score does not guarantee safe driving. That nuance is difficult to capture in policy language, but impossible to ignore in real life. As these concerns surfaced, the narrative surrounding the announcement began to shift. What was initially framed as a safety initiative was now being discussed as a complex web of incentives, liabilities, and unintended consequences. And that shift mattered because once public perception changes, policy momentum slows. That change in perception accelerated dramatically after senior advocacy leadership addressed their members directly. The message was not cautious. It was not softened. It was resolute. Leadership framed the issue plainly, arguing that safety was being used as a justification for discrimination and that age alone was being treated as evidence of incapacity. The message resonated because it acknowledged reality without surrendering dignity. It did not deny that some individuals should not be driving. It rejected the idea that millions should be tested and restricted simply to identify a smaller subset. The language was deliberate, invoking fairness, contribution, and independence. Seniors were reminded that they built communities, paid taxes, raised families, and navigated decades of social change. The implication was clear. A lifetime of responsibility should not end in automatic suspicion. That message spread quickly, not just among seniors, but among families who recognized what driving represents beyond transportation: autonomy, participation, control over one's daily life. Within hours, the conversation had expanded beyond policy analysis into something more personal. Adult children began asking what this would mean for their parents. Rural communities questioned how residents would function without alternatives. Civil liberties groups amplified concerns about age-based thresholds being used as regulatory shortcuts. The Department of Transportation, which had anticipated debate, now faced something far more difficult to manage: moral framing. Once an issue is framed as dignity versus bureaucracy, the calculus changes. Compromise becomes politically necessary, silence becomes risky, and recalculation begins. Officials stopped giving interviews. Statements became shorter, more measured. Behind the scenes, discussion shifted from implementation timelines to damage control. That doesn't mean the framework is gone. It means it's under pressure. And pressure is exactly what advocacy groups intended to apply. Because in moments like this, speed matters less than persistence. The goal isn't just to win the argument today. It's to ensure that any future attempt to restrict senior driving rights faces the same resistance from the very beginning. What made this moment even more unsettling was how quickly the federal announcement was echoed at the state level. Within the same 48-hour window, several state legislators introduced companion bills that didn't merely align with the federal framework, but expanded on it. Some proposed lowering the age threshold even further. Others suggested adding additional layers of testing beyond what federal guidelines outlined. Insurance industry groups publicly endorsed these state efforts, framing them as necessary local safeguards. At the same time, lobbying activity increased sharply around physician liability protections aimed at shielding doctors who report patients while placing more responsibility on those who don't. When multiple pieces move at once, it's rarely coincidence. It signals coordination. Transportation analysts noted that this kind of synchronized action typically occurs only when agencies believe they have a narrow window to act before opposition fully mobilizes. The goal appears to be momentum. If enough states begin aligning with the framework early, resistance becomes harder to sustain. But that strategy also carries risk, because if early adopters face backlash, the entire effort can stall. And that's exactly the scenario beginning to unfold. State-level senior organizations responded by shifting focus. Rather than concentrating solely on federal courts, they began applying pressure locally, targeting governors, transportation departments, and state legislators who had quietly signaled support. The message was simple and direct. Supporting this framework would not be politically neutral. It would be remembered. And in states where seniors make up a significant portion of the electorate, that warning carries weight. Rural legislators in particular found themselves caught between safety advocates and constituents who rely almost entirely on personal vehicles. In many areas, public transportation simply doesn't exist. Removing driving privileges doesn't encourage safer alternatives. It removes mobility altogether. That reality complicates any attempt to sell this framework as universally beneficial. The more the policy expanded outward, the more its weaknesses became visible. One-size-fits-all solutions rarely survive contact with lived experience, and senior advocates were determined to make sure those experiences were heard loudly and repeatedly. Now, attention is turning to what happens next, because the next 30 to 60 days will likely determine the direction of this entire fight. Congressional sources indicate emergency hearings are being scheduled not as a formality, but as a response to mounting pressure. Members of the Senate Transportation Committee are reportedly requesting detailed justification for each provision, including the data used to support cognitive screening thresholds and renewal intervals. In the House, discussions are underway about legislative options that could block or delay implementation by restricting federal funding tied to the framework. These are not symbolic gestures. Funding controls are one of the few levers Congress can pull quickly when agencies move faster than expected. Meanwhile, legal teams representing senior organizations are preparing for a protracted battle, one that could stretch well beyond February 2026 if injunctions are granted. Their objective is not only to stop implementation, but to establish precedent that prevents similar age-based frameworks from being introduced in the future. Inside the Department of Transportation, the mood has reportedly shifted. Officials who initially spoke confidently about safety and consistency are now emphasizing dialogue and stakeholder input. Those phrases tend to appear only after resistance proves stronger than anticipated. Washington has gone noticeably quieter. And quiet in this context doesn't mean resolution. It means recalculation. Regulators are reassessing political cost, legal vulnerability, and public perception all at once because they now understand something they may have underestimated. Seniors are not an easy group to push. They vote reliably. They organize efficiently. And when independence is threatened, they respond with a level of focus few other groups can match. Whether the framework is scaled back, delayed, or pushed forward in modified form remains to be seen. But one thing is already clear. This issue is no longer confined to policy briefings and regulatory language. It has become a national conversation about autonomy, fairness, and how society treats people as they age. And once a conversation reaches that level, it doesn't end quietly. What we're watching now is not just a policy dispute, but a test of political will. On one side is a federal agency attempting to reshape how senior driving is regulated nationwide. On the other is one of the most organized, experienced, and reliable voting populations in the country, making it clear that age alone will not be accepted as a reason to limit independence. State governments are weighing how much authority they're willing to surrender. Advocacy groups are deciding how far they're prepared to push this fight, and industry players are watching closely, calculating risk, cost, and exposure. The next move hasn't been made yet, but everyone involved knows it's coming. That's why the silence from Washington right now feels so heavy. When regulators go quiet after an announcement this big, it doesn't mean they're backing down. It means they're choosing their next step carefully. Behind closed doors, options are being evaluated. Scale back the framework and risk appearing weak, delay implementation and invite legal scrutiny, push forward unchanged and trigger a prolonged court battle that could drag on for years. None of those paths are easy and all of them carry consequences. Senior advocates understand this moment perfectly. Their strategy is not to wait and react, but to stay visible, vocal, and relentless. They want every decision maker to understand that this issue will not fade from public attention, that every vote, every statement, every procedural maneuver will be remembered. Because for seniors, this is not an abstract debate about transportation safety. It's about whether a lifetime of responsibility ends with the presumption of incompetence. It's about whether independence is treated as a right or a privilege that must be constantly re-earned. And it's about whether policy can be built around individuals rather than averages. What happens next will unfold quickly. Emergency hearings, legal filings, revised language, political pressure applied quietly and publicly at the same time. And throughout it all, millions of seniors will be watching, listening, and talking to one another about what this means for them personally. That collective awareness is already reshaping the conversation. The Department of Transportation may have expected debate. It did not expect this level of unified resistance. It did not expect advocacy groups to move so fast or so precisely. And it did not expect this issue to become a symbol of something much larger. How a society values experience, how it balances safety with dignity, and how it decides who gets to keep control over their own lives. This story is far from over. February 2026 is not tomorrow, but it's close enough to demand attention now. The decisions made in the next few weeks will shape what that date actually means, whether it marks the start of sweeping new restrictions, a delayed rollout under heavy scrutiny, or a retreat from policies that move too fast, too broadly. For now, one thing is undeniable. Seniors have drawn a line. They've shown they will not accept quiet erosion of independence. They've reminded Washington that they are organized, informed, and engaged, and they've made it clear that any attempt to redefine their rights will be met with resistance at every level. The Department of Transportation learned something important this week. Seniors do not surrender freedom without a fight. They do not disengage when challenged, and they do not forget. Whatever happens next, this moment will be remembered as the point when the battle over senior driving rights moved out of policy papers and into the national spotlight. The stakes are real, the outcome is still undecided, and the country is watching.